Hello. Today we are talking about state legislatures. This is covered in Chapter 7 of your textbook. It's a topic, like so many of the topics covered in this course, that has a lot of diversity. We will try and focus on some of the commonality, but the truth is how these legislatures are set up, how they operate, varies considerably from one state to another. There's some generalities that we can talk about, and yet we also have to recognize that the way that the legislatures are set up also, there's a lot of differences. So some of the similarities are legislatures routinely deal with taxes, budgets. You have to fund a budget by getting money. Most of the time that is done by collecting money from taxes. Taxes or fees, primarily taxes. So, of course, legislatures also have to deal with the federal government because of the fact that we have a federal system where there's some area of overlap and a lot of distinct areas of responsibility between the states and the national government. The differences are because the legislatures are set up by state constitution, and so they are these constitutions differ considerably from state to state. The functions of the legislatures are in some ways parallel to the functions of the U.S. Congress. So the legislatures primarily, you might say, are one of their chief functions, certainly, is writing legislation, lawmaking. The people in the legislature are elected from districts. Those districts are set up and drawn by the legislature themselves. And we're going to talk later about the issue of gerrymandering, which occurs at the state level. In other words, for the state legislatures, just as it occurs for the U.S. Congress. The state legislatures also, or the legislators also perform constituent service. This is a very important function. It might not be something that you think of if you haven't taken political science class, but it is a very important function, especially for those legislators who are intended to get reelected. If you want to get the vote of somebody, then one of the best ways to do this is to make sure that you're useful. And one of the ways you can do this is by responding to complaints or concerns. Could be, somebody concerned about traffic noise from a highway. It could be, mothers concerned with speeding motorists through their neighborhood. And sometimes the legislators aren't able to do anything about this at all. Well, sometimes they are. And legislators who have a department that is, or an office that performs effectively in the realm of constituent service have a easier chance of getting reelected. And of course, oversight, in other words, oversight of the executive branch. Remember, the executive branch, just as paralleled by in the federal system, the national system is the governor is in charge of appointing agency heads. So, the state Department of Natural Resources, or just for example, if there's an issue of competence or corruption or whatever, a problem that comes to light, um, the relevant legislature might play a role in trying to get to the bottom of it, or alternatively, making political hay out of it, right? One of the issues with reactivity, with lawmaking, is reactivity. How are they? Are they being proactive, or are they just responding to a problem after uh, it hits the fan? Um, the lawmaking function can be affected by the very nature of the legislature. If you're talking about a part-time legislature, its effectiveness in lawmaking might be considerably less than a longer a legislature that is compensated as if this were a full-time job and with those expectations. Um, of course, it's also affected by the relationship with the governor. For example, is the governor of the same party or not? Um, in Maryland, we have a state legislature that is predominantly Democratic, and we have a Republican governor. And the relationship can be adversarial, less so than in some other states, actually. Sometimes this can be extremely problematic, such as the state of Illinois, which has the difficulties of the relationship between the legislature and the governor have manifested themselves in budget crises, long, painful, and costly budget crises. One of the um, factors in lawmaking is the role of lobbyists. Uh, Lobbyists play a huge role in lawmaking, depending on the legislature. When, especially if the legislature is part-time, and say, for example, governed by term limits, you might have a lot of legislators in there who are overburdened, trying to do two jobs, inexperienced, and extremely receptive to a little help from their lobbyist friends. People who will often write legislation and prepare the legislation that will then be introduced under the name of a particular legislator. So this is, in some legislatures, standard practice, and we have some very strong lobbying groups, such as, for example, ALEC is one of the strongest at the state level, which prepares legislation that is then adopted at the state level, often with minimal review. How does this legislation go through? Well, there are different approaches. Long-term tactics would be coalition building. Log rolling is basically exchanging of favors, but it's more sort of a exchanging of compromise. Let's put it that way, as to move legislation forward. In the short term, you do have, just as again at the national level, you have the institution or the practice of filibusters. That is the tactic of stopping progress on legislation, usually at the state senate level. And riders are essentially pieces of legislation that are most tangential to the main thrust of a piece of legislation. It's essentially little sugar to help get legislation through an attempt to um, buy votes, bluntly speaking, not with money necessarily, but with uh, some extra element that makes the legislation more attractive. So who's represented in this, in the legislature? Well, you do have citizen interests. Sometimes those are represented through their own interest groups, right? You have um, you know, local or state branches of groups, for example, of like the Sierra Club or various advocacy groups that will petition for certain legislation. Um, but you also have commercial interests that will push for certain legislation or certain policies. We mentioned constituent service. Um, this is extremely important for getting reelected. Sometimes this is one of the most important characteristics that of a particular legislator. People might say, well, I don't really know what legislation he's produced, but he's always there for our town, you know, um, for individuals in our community. The oversight function, as I said, is um, primarily concerns the relationship of the legislature with the executive branch. Um, this is affected by term limits. For one thing, if with term limits, like most other aspects, have negatives and positives. On the positive side, the argument is that you're allowing room for new blood to come in. You're limiting the amount of time for cozy relationships to develop between particular legislators and interest groups. On the other hand, the ability of individual legislators to get deep expertise and deep institutional knowledge is limited by term limits. And this, in turn, can limit their ability to effectively perform their oversight function. In general, legislatures are bicameral. That means two chambers, literally two chambers, right? So there's a House of Delegates and a state Senate, for example. Um, these might have all sorts of different names. It varies from state to state, right? The good trivia question, but it might very well appear on a quiz or an exam question, is what state does not have a bicameral legislature, and that would be Nebraska. And Nebraska and Maine are also the two states that award their electoral votes in the Electoral College proportionally. So Nebraska is sort of its own special case. So the particulars of how large these legislatures are varies considerably state to state. One of the things you can say, one of the commonalities, is that the legislative leadership plays a disproportionate role in moving legislation through. It really does matter who's in charge. The legislative leadership they are the agenda setters. They're the people who determine what legislation is moving forward, what are the policy priorities that are going to be chosen. This is done by the legislative leadership, and there is a marked difference in status and compensation between the rank and file and the leadership. most of the work that is done in legislatures is done at the committee level. Um, so then this is true of state legislatures and of the U.S. Congress. By the time that a piece of legislation comes up for a vote, the votes should mostly be in line, right? If there are surprises, that means that either the leadership is not really performing its job very well, or else perhaps the legislation is extraordinarily controversial. We saw this recently a few years ago when there was a move to the so-called repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, and at the last minute, John McCain did not vote for his party's effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and this was one of the most of the times when things are coming to the floor, things are not that dramatic. So most of the real work is done in committee. When legislation is introduced, it is assigned to specific committees, and it goes through a process of hearings and eventually being voted out of committee. And who is in charge, who is the majority party, is extremely important in this role. Caucuses sometimes the word is itself confusing because there are caucuses such as the Iowa caucus, for example, that happens in place of a primary in Iowa. This is not the type of caucus we're talking. Caucuses are essentially groups of elected legislators. So you can talk about the caucus of, I don't know, the Women's Caucus, or more broadly, you might talk about the Republican Caucus, or you might talk group the Freedom Caucus on the Republican side, the Tea Party Republicans. It's sort of a subgroup of legislators, and they can function as voting blocks, which can lead them to be attaining sort of disproportionate power. So how do we decide who is representing whom in the legislature? Well, this happens through a process of drawing up districts. This is done after the census. This is parallel to the U.S. Congress. There's a fair amount of diversity in legislatures, but overall, the process of gerrymandering is, I will say, unfortunately common across the United States. And I think it's important to recognize this gerrymandering affects not just representation in Washington, but also representation in state capitals. So gerrymandering is essentially a process that drawing district lines for partisan advantage. Long and short of it. I will probably post a little film about this as well, just kind of graphically show how this happens. But if you can draw the lines in different ways, and if you draw them, the district lines, in one way, you might get a representation, you might get a majority of, for example, Republican legislatures, even though the majority of the voters are not Republicans, and this has happened actually in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. This is the subject of a number of cases that have come before the Supreme Court. Perhaps one of the most notorious cases was in North Carolina. So this is, and it is something that is, it's not exclusively Republican practice by any means. Maryland is one of the cases that is cited as a situation where the Democrats have gerrymandered districts to benefit that party. The 6th congressional district, again, this is 6th congressional, so this is not state politics, but the 6th congressional district that is includes Hagerstown is recognized as a gerrymandered district, and even the man who currently is elected to fill that to represent that district, John Delaney, would be the first person to acknowledge that, and he's quite open about that. So this is a real issue, and states kind of try and get around it in different ways. One of the ways is drawing up citizen, nonpartisan citizen committees to draw the districts, and this has been tried in places like Arizona. And even with that, things get controversial because for some people, gerrymandering is, if you've got the power, it can be very attractive. So the state legislators, the contrast between delegates and trustees, this is sort of a conceptual, philosophical issue. A delegate is someone who sees his role or her role as really there just to represent the views of the electorate, whether or not the legislator agrees or disagrees with those views. And the trustee position is someone who is elected and is more concerned about making wise decisions for the state as a whole, rather than making decisions that narrowly benefit or reflect the interests of his or her particular constituents. Now, of course, in reality, these are abstractions, right? So people really usually don't fall into one category entirely. Usually there's some blurring of the lines, and legislators are a little bit of delegate and a little bit of trustee. But this is, conceptually, this is how two different ways of looking at the job. That job, who are these people? Oftentimes these are people who get into politics. They frequently do have a professional background. They're coming, perhaps they might be a successful businessman or a businesswoman. They might be, an attorney, though not exclusively. It's, some people think that all legislators are attorneys. That is definitely not the case. So in general, the diversity, again, this varies state by state, but in general, the demographic diversity continues to be heavily weighted in favor of white guys, and a lot of this is because of the power dynamics of the society, right? Women are less likely to be involved running, at a high level business to make those sort of connections that are necessary to do the fundraising, et cetera, et cetera. And the same applies for racial minorities. So the U.S. states in general have quite a ways to go as far as attaining real demographic diversity. There is this again, philosophical divide about um, the role of the legislature. Should they be professional, or should they be like the sort of the Jeffersonian ideal of the legislators going off and leaving their farm for a few months and then you know going off to the state capitol and doing their civic duty and then going back to the farm. You know, it's a nice ideal, um, and to some extent, it depends on the size of the state. Um, what is possible in Vermont, for example, is not so feasible in California. Just doesn't work out that way. Um, by the same token, I think it's important to recognize that just because a legislature is full-time and so-called professional doesn't mean that it's necessarily, um, proportionally more productive. A legislature like New York is full-time, professional, and in some rankings, it's ranked one of the least efficient and most corrupt legislatures. So it's a complicated question, right? A lot of this does have to do with the political culture of the state. Going back to chapter 1 and that broad categorization of political culture. One of the things I think it's important to recognize, one of the problems that has gotten worse in recent years with state legislatures is the fact that the media coverage of the state legislatures has gotten much worse. This is partly a reflection of the change of the media environment, that the local newspapers, the state level newspapers that used to have a bureau at the State House, those have diminished dramatically. So you don't have a number of independent newspapers that were competing with each other to cover the state legislature. You don't. You just don't. And so who is keeping an eye on how the legislature is functioning? Well, frequently, these might be interest groups, right? Let's just say the Sierra Club, for example, might be trying to activate its members about what different legislators are doing and potential problems going down the road. But that's fine. So who are they talking to? They're talking to their membership. They might be trying to inform some local media, but fact is there is no independent monitoring of what the legislature is doing. And as a consequence, many people would argue the functioning of the legislature is negatively affected because no one's watching. And this is true really across the board. As I said, there's a lot of variation across the state legislatures in this country, but there are some commonalities, and this is one of the commonalities. Also, this whole idea of term limits, the issue is a commonality. The way that the legislatures have implemented term limits is a different question. The legislators sometimes, in some states, are facing these limits. Term limits are one of those that are very appealing on one level, but they don't necessarily lead to increasing diversity, for example. They do increase turnover, and that for its own sake, you might argue that's worthwhile. But again, there's pros and cons on this. And bottom line, they definitely they essentially give more power to the executive branch. Not only that, but also to the lobbyists, because legislators come and go, but the lobbyists are not limited by term limits, right? they're there year in, year out, and they often know the workings of the state legislature better than the legislators themselves. So the legislators are, in some ways, operating at a disadvantage in their relationship vis-a-vis the lobbyists. So in summary, the legislatures are frequently not paid much attention by the public, except, in people who are really keyed into state and local politics. But I'd be willing to bet several cups of coffee that probably 9/10 of you couldn't name your state legislator, either your state senator or your state rep. There's still mistrust. There's still this sort of mistrust of government in general, and that leaks over onto the legislature. And the same partisan divide, hyperpartisanship that affects our politics at our national level also affects the operations, unfortunately, at the state level, although to less of a degree.